So, hello all and welcome to my presentation Thinking Outside the Linux Box, where we will be talking about humans and how they may affect system security. A few words about myself. So I'm Esa Jääskelä from Oulu, Finland. I work as an embedded system developer at a company called Buutti, doing variety of consultancy projects there. In addition to that, I also write blog at ejääskelä.dev. I have, for example, had this quite long ongoing series about Yocto hardening, and I will also publish a summary of this presentation there, let's say within the next week once I get it finished. I also want to give this usual disclaimer that security advice is not a one-size-fits-all solution, so consider carefully what applies to you. Okay, now that I've managed to pull the rug under my own feet, let's begin with the presentation. Or let's not. I was thinking back in spring when I got this email about call for presentations for the Open Source Summit, I started to think that, okay, what would I like to present? It maybe could be something about cybersecurity. I didn't have a clear topic in mind, so I started, searching for these different hardening features that, how to make a system more secure and then maybe perform a deep dive or something like that. And then nothing really caught my attention, so I started to kind of create a sort of a complete system hardening model on how to completely harden a system. And I came up with something like this, where you have these different blocks and you try to harden them all, and then you would have a completely hardened system. But I felt that this was actually quite a narrow view of looking at things. So it started to feel like I was actually trying to create a system for an adversary, so that this system is just a hacking exercise for them. So they just try to break into the device, and that's the sole reason the device exists. But that's not the purpose why we are usually creating these embedded devices. We are actually creating them for the users, and we are creating them to create value for these users. When we think about it this way, if we solely focus on hardening the system for the sake of hardening, so that it's hard for the adversaries to break into, we may actually miss the easiest way for the adversaries to gain control of the system, and that is through users or user interfaces. And that is basically the core point of this presentation. There is, of course, one additional group that has a lot of input on the Linux box that we are creating, and that group is the developers. So we basically have these three human actor groups that I will be talking about in this presentation: adversaries, users, and the developers, and a bit about how they relate to each other. So, developers and users have this friendly back and forth communication, usually friendly, and adversaries may try to affect these two groups of people. A bit of extra motivation for considering these human actors in your security model. So most cyber attacks utilize humans. The exact number varies a bit between 60 and 90, depending on what you consider, for example, a human interaction. But it's safe to say that most. In addition to that, humans are usually used for the initial access, trying to get into the system. And if we can prevent these initial accesses, we can usually prevent the rest of the attack as well. Then another thing, so technology almost always interacts with humans. It's not always, of course, but most of the time we are creating something that is meant to be used by a human, or the end result of the product is used by a human. Maybe notable exceptions are, for example, satellites that get launched into outer space for extraterrestrial life forms to find, but not all of us have the luxury of sending our stuff to the outer space. We are forced to deal with them here on Earth. Then, even if you manage to create a completely hardened system, that's a monumentous task to achieve. But humans are easier to manipulate than machines. So if you have the completely hardened system, you cannot really manipulate a vulnerability into that. But since we have that human in one form or another next to the system, there tends to be this. It depends if you're an optimist or pessimist. If you're optimist, you say first line of defense against adversaries. If you're pessimist, you may say the weakest link of the security. But the human is usually always somewhere there. And even if humans are not manipulatable, you have these cold, emotionless people who don't, sway to any kind of persuasion, then humans may also make honest mistakes. These happen, and we need to prepare for these kind of problems. Next, let's continue a bit about, the three groups. Talk a bit more about them. So, the developers and the users and the adversaries. So, developers are the people who take part into creating a product. I suppose that's everyone in this room, either directly, like programmers or engineers or managers who are really hands-on with the product, or support functions like sales, legal, marketing, etc., that may have some input on the product, but are not directly performing some sort of engineering work on it. Then we also have indirect developers or supply chain. These may be suppliers who, for example, sell licensable software libraries or deliver some hardware, and also open source developers. So it is important to consider these indirect or supply chain as well, because they may introduce certain vulnerabilities into the system. Then we have the users. So these are the people who use the product as it's intended to be used. Developer hopefully creates a product that brings value to the user. User uses the product and in return gives maybe cash and bug tickets and whatnot. And depending on your exact type of product, these may be like factory workers working on industrial control systems, or consumers who buy an IoT solution, or even other developers if you are developing something like a software platform, for example. It's worth mentioning that developers and users can be in the same organization, so this is not like a organization-based categorization, it's a role-based categorization. Okay, things are going very well at the moment. We have two cooperative parties and then we have adversaries. And this is where things start to get problematic. So these are the people who want to use the product for their own purposes, on their own terms, like gaining in some unintended functionality. Trying to, for example, get the product you've created to join into their botnet or something like that. Or try to steal information or intellectual property from the device. Or they may just simply want to deny the service that the product is providing for the users. The groups of people that fall into this category range from hackers and crackers. The skill level varies a lot, from the very low to extremely high. Motivations vary, doing it just for the fun or renown or whatever. There are a lot of reasons and motivations in this group. And then there are, of course, cyber criminals who usually want to make money. These are professionals and often surprisingly skilled. And then nation states, for example, hopefully most of us don't have to worry about these on a daily basis, but some have to. Really skilled, really resourceful, and really motivated, usually. And finally, a bit of a special group, so insiders. And insiders are users or developers who either knowingly or unknowingly become adversaries, and they start to acting, against the agreed rules. And in certain extent, these are the most dangerous ones because they have this insider knowledge that they can utilize. Few more words about adversaries and what they may perform, what they may do. So adversaries may try to directly attack the product, and this is to defend the product from this, you want to perform the usual hardening actions. So the technical countermeasures that I was kind of talking about in the beginning. So this may prevent the adversary like breaking the boot flow or modifying the kernel or something like that. And that is an important part of the overall security of the product. Okay, but sometimes if the adversary is not able to perform the task that they need to perform, and they are motivated, and they have the skill, they may also try to, variety of social engineering attacks, and these are quite common these days. So I suppose everyone these days has received a phishing email, or may hopefully not spear phishing email, but there are multiple types of attacks that can happen. In addition, like pre-baiting or pretexting. And these are commonly directed towards users. I suppose that's because users are easier to manipulate because they do not know the system maybe as thoroughly as developer does, and developer can spot some red flags, for example, if they receive weird requests for certain credentials, for example. But developers aren't completely safe either. And the thing about socially engineering developers is that there is a bigger potential impact there. So that's why it might be interesting to try and target developers, because developers can modify how the device behaves, or they can, introduce vulnerabilities into it. And remember, developers may also contain the supply chain of the product. So even if you are not directly being influenced, somebody in your supply chain may be. And these social engineering attacks may have a variety of possible goals, like trying to gain some information about the device, or trying to gain the access directly, or trying to get the person to act on attacker's behalf. So, for example, opening certain ports on a firewall that allows the attacker to proceed with their action or something like that. Okay, at this point it's safe to say that we have these humans around our product, but what about the problems that arise from these? We briefly discussed the social engineering, but what are the core reasons that we try to tackle? And I think that there are roughly two problems that are related to humans or human actors, and these are human interface problems and then human behavior problems. Again, human interfaces, these are things that are technical problems and things that could be fixed, for example, with proper system hardening. Because we need to have these interfaces in other products we are creating, because if we create a product without a single interface, we are basically creating a radiator. It takes electricity and generates heat, and that's more or less all that it does. So we need to have some sort of interfaces in the device. And these problems are related to developers, and they are planned. Well, the problems are not planned, but the interfaces are planned. And in practice, this means that we have these interfaces, but due to time constraints or lack of knowledge, they may get implemented in unsecure ways. So, for example, installing an SSH server to that product, this is not necessarily a problem. Usually it isn't, but misconfiguring the server or running outdated software or something like that, that's when the interface becomes a problem. Now I have put human interfaces or human to parentheses because sometimes it's surprising what interfaces may become human interfaces when people start working around the system and not with the system. And it's tempting to think that, okay, I'm here deep down in the firmware level, this doesn't bother me. But the thing is, even if it doesn't become a user interface, it may become an adversary interface. Adversary may want to directly interface with the lower level components of the system. Okay, then the other maybe more erratic type of problem, so the human behavior. And this may be less technical. It's usually at least to some degree technical, because we are talking about technical products, but it may be less technical. And this mostly relates to end users, but also developers perform certain actions and have behavior towards a product even after it is published. So this applies to both groups. This kind of a behavior may be planned. For example, if we add a login feature to the device, it is expected that somebody uses that login feature, because why would we have that interface if nobody is using it? But on the other hand, people may exhibit some unexpected behavior on these interfaces that we are creating, and we should be prepared for that. So, for example, logging into a web portal, that's a great thing to do. That's what it's there for. But using a USB port of the device to charge a phone, that may be a problem if that USB interface is, for example, intended for example, for field firmware upgrades, and then somebody sticks a phone to it, and it might work. It might break the device or something in between. Or another favorite, so inserting emojis into a password field and then wondering why the login doesn't suddenly work anymore. That's something that humans do, and it's good to be prepared for something like that. But sometimes we also need to allow some certain behavior that is dangerous. I, for example, like to talk about this firewall a lot. So we, for example, need to sometimes allow changes to the firewall configuration, and that may allow some dangerous errors. And dangerous errors are this human behavior or human actions that will likely or immediately result in a security incident or some sort of a significant operational disruption in the system. And things like these may be caused by knowledge gaps or social engineering that was talked about before, or cognitive limitations, working tired and stressed and so on. So we may make these mistakes. And for example, like, again, sharing passwords with colleagues, not a good idea. Flushing all the firewall rules and not adding new ones, not a good idea. Or unplugging devices to find a place for your phone charger, also not a good idea. So these are, again, dangerous actions that the humans may take without necessarily even realizing that they are dangerous, and things that we should prepare for. Okay, at this point, I think we have established that we have these humans, and they cause different kinds of problems. So what can we do about this? Next that I'm going to show is a sort of a crude image how a firmware engineer believes that human acts. So this is basically a three-step process. So first we assume that human decides to perform an action. There is a lot of psychological science going into this, that okay, how and why and when a human decides to perform an action, but they may need to perform certain actions on a daily basis as a part of their job, or they may be socially engineered to perform certain actions. For one reason or another, person decides that they need to perform some sort of an action. Then they try to perform this action. They get an idea of this is a long step. It consists of, for example, doing the research that how can I perform this action, and maybe even trying to understand what the action is and so on. So this is not necessarily like clicking a button, but going through the menus of a system and trying to perform this action that they have gotten an idea of, that this is something that I need to do. And finally, they find the way of doing that thing that they want to do, and they do it. And when we think about the user actions this way, we can basically try to prevent dangerous errors or dangerous actions in the first two steps. So if we can prevent from people from thinking that it's a good idea to drop a production database, or if we can manage to prevent people from being capable of doing that. Those are two different things, and if we can sort of prevent these two actions, then that would be great. And the final one is mostly for damage control, that after after the action has been performed, we need to prepare for it. And for this, I'm going to show matching three sort of core ideas that I want to present. So to reduce the amount of dangerous ideas popping into people's heads, we want to create this secure organization environment. And then to reduce the possibilities of dangerous actions, we want to try and prevent people from compromising the security. And finally, after people manage to perform the dangerous action, as mentioned, sometimes we need to allow these, and we should hopefully try to avoid them from becoming errors that cause security incidents and such. We need to design for resilience. I will go a bit deeper into each of these three topics and present hopefully a bit more practical ideas how to apply these sort of high-level ideas. First, create a secure organization environment, and here we want to try to, with the organization and environment that we have, we want to try and prevent people from getting an idea that they need to perform a certain dangerous error or action. So first of all, the accepted communication methods. As you remember, the social engineering is a big problem here, because in general, people have at least quite good understanding of what they should and should not do. However, people are tempted when being socially engineered to perform something. That happens quite often. So to prevent something like that, we first of all would maybe want to list the communication methods that we agree. We would want to list the communication methods that are accepted in the day-to-day communications. Like, are we using email or Slack or Teams? If we are using both Teams and Slack for one reason or another, then when to use which one, and so on. So something like this should help creating a trustworthy organizational environment. In addition to that, we are not living in a isolation. We are talking to other organizations as well as part of the product development. So we need to also consider that how we can communicate securely with other organizations as well. At that point, we also preferably may want to have some named contact persons between the organizations, because if people start widely communicating with each other between the different organizations, that opens a lot of possibilities for social engineering or faking personalities or such. And finally, as a part of this bullet, sharing secrets. This is quite an important one, because sometimes we need to share secrets and confidential information. And if that need comes suddenly and that there's no plan for it, it's difficult to come up with a solid plan on how to share a secret securely. And we need to know that beforehand. Then for the secure organization, we also want to have these technical measures. This is a bit of a high-level statement, but things like, low-hanging fruit, two-factor authentication, that should hopefully prevent people from utilizing valid accounts to try and gain access to the organization communication methods. Other thing, for example, message filtering, to try and avoid receiving these, influence attempts towards us. Try to prevent those social engineering messages even from reaching us, because if we cannot see those messages, then they cannot affect us, hopefully. Then this is a thing that's easier said than done, but organization culture. You want to ensure that you have a security-minded organization, and you want to ensure that the actions actually line up with what your policies are. So there is not this mismatch where we say we are secure and then we are actually not, because this kind of a mismatch creates a lot of pushback, and which in return results in a lot of unsecure practices in the companies. Another thing that's very much easier said than done, so trying to foster a culture in a company where we don't have too much cognitive load. In practice, don't stress at work, which is not that easy in my opinion, but something like that is important so that we are not always completely mentally exhausted at work. And finally, everybody's favorite organizational security training, also known as phishing simulators and whatnot. For an effective training, you need to have personalized training, and these generic security trainings where we say that organizations these days face these threats. These unfortunately don't really work. So these should be personalized if at all possible. So sharing real attacks that the organization has faced and trying to learn from those. These are things that work a bit better. Okay, but despite these previous best efforts, a person has decided that I need to drop this database. They are starting to work actively towards performing that. So next thing that we want to do is prevent them from doing that. To avoid the dangerous error from occurring. And some practical steps. First of all, another maybe a bit more soft thing or soft skill or soft feature, however you want to think about it. So ensure that people have a complete understanding of the system. Easier said than done. But we want to ensure that first of all, developers understand that what they are creating, what is the value that they want to bring with this system, or why would a user use their system. And then on the other end, we want to ensure that users, at least on surface level, understand what the system does and how to use it. Preferably also the dangerous actions that they may make, or so that they are aware of maybe the biggest possible flaws, and then we try to bridge the understanding and knowledge gaps with some training and documentation. Then next one is extremely ambiguous. Follow the current security advice. I left this a bit ambiguous on purpose because this security advice changes constantly. But for example, these days it is not a good idea to rely solely on password authentication because people write the passwords on post-it notes and put them under the keyboards, and then the systems get hacked. Or another important thing like secure defaults, because people leave the devices on the default settings. So we want to ensure that the system is secured by default. Things like this need to be considered. Then maybe the most important one in preventing dangerous errors, so principle of the least privilege. We need to consider how many layers of authority, for example, we need to have in the system, because if answer cannot be one, because if everybody is an admin user, nobody is an admin user. So of course this depends a bit on your product, but in general you want to have at least 2 layers of authority where you have the regular and super users. And with this we want to prevent dangerous actions from being even theoretically possible for the users or developers as well. Sort of are related to this is sort of have the minimal amount of required interfaces available. So the most secure interface is the one that doesn't exist. So try to cut it down as little as possible. Then confirming dangerous actions, so having, for example, a few seconds of delay or something like that, that forces the person to think for a moment that is this a thing that I should be doing, or should I perhaps reconsider my actions at this point? Maybe a good example of this are code reviews where you seek approval from someone else and they can hopefully spot if you're making a big mistake. The thing is that this should not be overdone, because if the system becomes a terrible nuisance or tedious or extremely difficult to use, then this results in big problems, because people start working, around the system instead of using the system as it's intended to be used. And in these cases, unexpected things may become in the human interfaces. For example, if you have a front end and back end, and the front end is terrible to use, then people may be tempted to use the back end directly, which is not meant to happen. And something like this may result in big problems. Then, maybe a bit touchy subject, but monitoring can help detect some human behavior that may result in dangerous errors. However, nobody likes being monitored, myself included, so also it requires a lot of resources, and setting it up is a hassle, but it is something that may be required in certain situations. And testing is a thing that is important, I think, in every phase, but I put it here. So testing should give us some confidence that we can handle malicious inputs or incorrect inputs. Things like negative testing or fuzz testing, because fuzzing is random and people are random. So that's the best way to try and find out what the human may do. Okay, but we are now reaching the end of the action life cycle. So human has decided to perform an action. They did the research, they found the button, and they pressed the button. What happens next? So we need to design for resilience, and this is the most technical out of these 3 steps. In this phase, of course, we start from the very beginning. So we plan for the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario maybe commonly is that high access level insider decides to set the whole product on fire and see it burn. So you have to plan a scenario like this from the beginning. It's not necessarily as likely that an adversary, starts desoldering chips and so on to try to get the access to the things in memory. It is more likely that some certain human may copy-paste the key credentials to the wrong place or something like that. So you should maybe plan for that. Of course, again, depends on the product you're creating. Then this is basically what I originally thought that I wanted to present. So layered security, and this means that install multiple security features supporting one another to the system, so that if one of them fails, there is always the next one, trying to prevent the progress of the adversary. And you want to usually start from the interfaces, because those are the things that get used by the humans most, or that's maybe the way in for the adversaries. Of course, if you have, for example, an embedded device, then you may want to, the interface may be a bit different. It might be a serial interface, not necessarily a network interface, but some human-facing interface nevertheless. Then containment and isolation. So it might be a good idea that if one of your devices gets cracked, that doesn't mean that all of them are immediately vulnerable. So try to prevent this with, for example, unique keys and so on. In a similar fashion, so if you are developing a system that has client and server model, then try to ensure that if the client of your system gets cracked, it doesn't mean that the adversary has a free pass to the server afterwards, or try to have as little information of the server on the client. Have as little information about the server on the client as possible. I hope that sentence made sense. Then recovery mechanisms. The obvious one is, of course, firmware update, and that should be robust and functional in all the situations. But another important thing is how you can rotate your secrets, because if your keys leak or something like that, you need to consider that how can I return to this secure state, that I can again trust my device. Usually that cannot be achieved with a simple firmware update, so something that like that should be planned beforehand. And then intrusion detection. So unfortunately quite often the attacks go unnoticed for multiple months, or even if they are noticed, the alerts are ignored, and then everybody wonders that, oh, how did this happen? Well, it happened 3 months ago and you ignored the alert, but try to have some sort of an intrusion detection in place. And finally, training. So I like to consider both engineering training and security training, because if you have one without the other, it's difficult to create secure products. With engineering knowledge and without security knowledge, you can pump out features like crazy, but they are not secure. And if you have security knowledge but no engineering knowledge, then you'll end up as a consultant like me. Okay, then some suggestions to get started. I'll try to be quick. I'm running rapidly out of time. So identify the different actor groups around your product. Who are the users? Who are the developers? Who are in the supply chain? Try to have a guess who is the adversary, but that is not always possible before an incident. And attributing the adversary is usually difficult even after an incident, but try to do it. Then gain the situational awareness. So understand, your current vulnerabilities and what kind of threats you are facing. And are you currently in the middle of a big ongoing campaign, or is there a more peaceful period going on? Then ensure that these communication guidelines exist and are available. These are important, as mentioned, to help prevent social engineering, and these should be readily available, if there is a sudden need, sudden request for some weird information. And then important one, so identify the possible dangerous errors during the design, development, and deployment phases, so that in all parts of the product life cycle what things can go wrong, in a significant way, and try to mitigate these risks. Yes. And then this is very ambiguous advice. So implement the layered security. So basically saying just harden the device and start from the interfaces. But it's a bit of a monumentous task that one bullet point really doesn't do justice. But that's an important part of the overall security. And finally, try to input an emoji and see what happens. Things might break. In embedded world, things might physically break. Most of the time nothing, I suppose, happens, but it's a quick thing to try. As a conclusion, so humans need the interfaces. They cannot be avoided, otherwise we are building rocks. Humans will perform actions on these interfaces. That's why the interfaces exist. And try to survive with this. Thank you. Questions. One quick thing before we move on to questions. So I added to the slides a few more extra materials if you are interested. Okay. White wants to access my camera. Okay, yes, there was a question.
Yeah, first one, thanks so much for your blog post about the hardening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe it's in your reference, but there's something that is interesting to say about my sense of this presentation. The thread model.
Yeah.
There's a Mitri framework for embedded.
Yes.
Embedded 3.
Okay.
And there's an attack framework.
Yeah.
That's more for the human behavior.
Yeah.
And I think we should consider the human behavior in our thread model as well.
Yes.
We usually just think about the technical part, but maybe going more to IT department and see this human behavior.
Yeah.
And apply to our thread model to improve the security.
Yes, I agree. I mean, that was the message that I was hopefully trying to convey. And yeah, as mentioned here,
Thanks so much.
yeah. So the attack is really useful for if you have had cyber incidents before. You can use it to sort of map out that what actions the adversary has performed and try to see the common maybe possibly common, routes that they may take or something like that, and try to identify the weak points in your systems. Yes, any more questions? Yes?
Would you have some intrusion detection system to recommend?
I have used only one in my life. I'm not sure if I can recommend because I have nothing to compare to, but I have worked with Vasu. So it's basically, I worked with it in a way that I received this sort of how should I say? I received the logs basically from different endpoints, and then I received a pre-installed Vasu interface, and going through the logs, and it was really enlightening experience. So you could basically use that to see, for example, if certain files had been modified in the file system, or sudden elevated sudo uses or something like that. So something like that could be used for intrusion detection. I think it might be a bit of an overkill, but I recommend giving it a go. I know that there isn't a Yocto recipe for that yet, but I'm considering a bit writing one, but let's see. There is so many hours in a day that one can enjoy with Yocto. Yeah, well, let's see.